With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program. I know that we're super late. We're not at our normal time. We're almost an hour and 45 minutes behind where we normally are. I do really apologize for that. What happened is we had a technical difficulty and our broadcasting system was not working. So here we are. Better late than never, I guess. So thank you for being a dedicated fan to the show and being with us if you're watching us this late. Thank you so much for your patience. And there is a lot to get to today. And I know that we have been doing this and we're doing the best that we can to stay as up to date as humanly possible on all of these stats. We are, as always, going to start off with an update on the coronavirus specifically in how it is affecting this great state of Alabama. So here is our daily update from the Alabama Department of Public Health. If I can go ahead and get that pulled up. There we go. And so you can see that the latest report from the Alabama Department of Public Health, you can look at the different counties there, and we have had a substantial increase. The most alarming one, I would say, is one that's right here in the local area, because you have Elmore County with 5, Lee County with 10, Jefferson, of course, leading the pack by a great distance, but that was always expected. Jefferson County only about an hour from where we are right now here in Montgomery, and of course, well within our listening audience here in the state of Alabama. So there's quite an alarming bump today, because we had a plus 27 since yesterday, because yesterday we were at 51. Now we are at 78. You can check my math there. So with 87 confirmed cases and no deaths, that's something that is exponential. And what I mean by exponential, you'll recall that I was talking about yesterday that thus far the increase in Alabama's cases has been steady. Now they're exponential. So instead of just raising up about 10, because we had 10 one day, 12 another day, those are pretty close. You can compare those two. They almost tripled today, which means we are now having exponential growth in the number of cases. And the exponential spike is bad news for us, because as long as it maintained to be about 10 a day or maybe 15 a day, even if it was growing little by little, that's not an exponential spike. That's not a spike that is doubling or tripling. Now that we're having a spike that almost triples the number of new cases and confirmed cases we had yesterday, there is a good chance that what we were looking at is called an exponential growth curve. Now, if that happens, and if this follows suit with the way that other places that have had coronavirus cases have been, and we're not sure yet. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. I don't want to overstate this or cause a panic or make you think that there's doom and gloom around every corner, because, this may just be that we had more tests done today, and that's the reason for the spike. There's a number of reasons that there could be this outlier here. But if this case is really exponential, there's a chance that we could have almost 30 today, 27 today. Maybe we have 50 new ones tomorrow, 100 new ones the day after that, 200, 400, 800. I mean, you see where this thing could go if an exponential spike continues to go up, and before you know it, we're Italy or China, where a good portion of our state has it, and we're all just kind of hiding out in our shelters here in our houses or residence or wherever, trying to wait this thing out. That could happen. And today is a sign that shows that it is more likely to happen than the data that was available to us yesterday. It does not mean, though, that it is a guarantee. So I do want to state the importance of this. This is a bad sign, but it is not a sign that guarantees that we're going to get to the levels of Italy or China. And if we do, it may take us a little longer than them. As I've said, America as a country, not Alabama specifically, but based on the number of cases that we're seeing compared country to country, America is roughly 50 days behind China. And right now, China is getting back to work. People are starting to come out of their shelters. They have no new cases. Take that with a grain of salt because it's the government of China that's telling us that. But at least according to them, there are no new cases and a large portion of their population is starting to recover. So even if we are seeing an exponential spike, and even if we do have a massive number of new cases in the next 24, 48, and 72 hours, even if that's the worst case scenario, even if that does take place, 50 days from now, we're still going to be pretty much on the road to recovery. By the first week in May, we should be more or less have this thing behind us, at least if this thing turns out to be a seasonal flu, which there is actually new data that I'm going to share with you later in the show that shows that it is, but we'll get to that after our update for here in Alabama. Now, this second graph that I want to show you, it shows a state-by-state comparison, and it does not honestly bode well for the state of Alabama on this particular graphic. So this is a state of the U.S. that you can see there. This is provided by the CDC. And you'll notice that Alabama is not one of the darker states, which would denote that it was one of the highest concentrations of COVID-19. But you'll notice that New York and Washington are real dark. California's a little less dark than them, but still pretty dark. And then there's not that many states that are close to their levels of corona. And then if you look at us, then we're, not super dark, but certainly darker than a lot of the states around us, with the exception of Florida and Georgia. And oddly enough, Louisiana, probably because those are cities that have ports of entry. Atlanta is a really big airport. Of course, Florida has several points of entry all over it. And then Louisiana, a large portion of its southern border is port town. So there's a lot of in and out with the state of Louisiana. So you could kind of tell that that's the case. And you'll notice here that we're definitely not one of the worst states, but we're also not one of the best. And to help you better understand exactly where we stand compared to other states, here's a third graphic that I want to show you, and this eliminates all of the states that are either at the same level of us or have worse cases of the coronavirus, the Wuhan Flu, than we do. And you'll notice that you've got West Virginia, which is still hanging in there with 1 to 5, and every other state on this map is in the 60 to 50 range, which is less than us because we now have 78 confirmed cases. By the way, even more bad news, granted this doesn't change our standing on this particular map because it measures 50 to 100, so we're still in that tier of this particular statistic. But they were still using the data from yesterday that suggested that we had only 51 cases. Now we're even further up the scale, and if you count the number of states that was on that map, you would notice that there were 25 states that have less than us, which means we went from having 0 cases and being one of the states with the least amount, because you'll remember there were 4 states left when we still had 0 cases. It was us, West Virginia, Alaska, and I believe Idaho. But the point is, we went from being one of the 4 states in the entire country that didn't have a case to having 78 cases in just a couple of days. Now, what does that mean? It means a couple of things. First of all, it is alarming that we went into the top 50% from having 0 and being in the bottom 4. The fact that we went there so quickly is quite staggering, and what it probably means, the fact that this happened so fast, I don't think that Alabamians are being infected at a higher rate and it's spreading faster. I think what happened is we've actually had a pretty bad case of this for a long time because we're so close to areas of high concentration like Georgia, like Florida, and we've actually had several people with this thing for weeks now, but we were not testing, and now that we're testing, we're actually finding, okay, we actually do have a pretty significant amount of people compared to other states, much more so than we originally thought. It also could mean that we were not taking precautions correctly. I have noticed, this is my general observation, so there's no data on this, this is just Caleb's perception, that there are an awful lot of people in the state of Alabama that were not taking this seriously, that did not want to take precautions, that were not self-quarantining, that were treating this basically like it was going to blow over and be no big deal. And there was a time, granted it was a long time ago, I jumped on board before a lot of the average people did just because I study the news, but there was a time where I was kind of in that mentality, and it seemed like it took Alabamians much longer than people in other states to understand what a big deal this was probably going to be, and because of that, they did not take protective measures earlier on. I think it's more likely a combination of those two things. A combination of the fact that we didn't take precautions very early, and a combination of the fact that we were not testing, which would be, a precaution, so they kind of bleed into one another. But because of that, that's why you're seeing this massive spike in such a short amount of time. I don't think it means that Alabama is sicker than the rest of the nation or that we're going to be one of the big hot zones for it. I think it is just a sign that we did not prepare for this thing adequately, and also that we were not testing the way that we should have. Is it possible that some of the other states that don't have as many cases are just not testing as well? Perhaps. But I think that the more likely explanation, and granted Alabama would typically fall into this tier, so I'm not saying that this is a non-factor, but I want you to notice that if you look back at that map, in fact, I'll just go ahead and pull that map back up. Remember, these are the states that have fewer than 50 cases. If you look at this map right here, what's something you notice about it? Look at the states that have it, and look at the states that have more of it that are grayed out. These are the states with lower concentrations of the coronavirus. Not a lot of states with big population centers. In fact, if you're looking at the total metro population, so not just the city proper, but the larger metropolitan area of each city, you have to go all the way down to number 14 to get one of the states on that map that has a major metropolitan area. That would be Phoenix. And then you have to get to number 18th to get to St. Louis, which would, of course, be Missouri, which also has fewer than 50 cases, which is a pretty strong indication that these big population centers are the reason that this thing is spreading so quickly. It spreads faster the closer people are together. That stands to reason. And so that doesn't really tell us all that much that we didn't know, but it does show that being in a more rural, secluded area where people tend to be more spread out is going to put you at a far lower risk than people that are in a very crowded, populated area, because all of the states that have the highest concentration are heavily populated areas. States like New York, like California, like Washington, like Florida, these tend to be states with very large metropolitan cities in them. Texas is another example. So that's really what it tells us, but that's just sort of the update and the status, the raw numbers. Let's actually dive into the politics and some of what's being done about that, because, y'all, Meemaw K has had a really, really big day. She has been super, super busy. And some of the things that she's done, I think, make sense. Some of the things that she's done, not so much. But we're going to go through that. She actually released a statement earlier today that explained some of the steps that the governor's office has been taking. So I'm going to go ahead and read through this. Blah, blah, blah. Governor Kay Ivey, the Department of Public Health, Tuesday, statewide health order, Alabama's records. You know, the legal mumbo-jumbo that they have to say to get this stuff kicked off. Statewide through April 5th. So these are measures that are supposed to be observed until April 5th, which is a couple of weeks from now. Quote, all gatherings of 25 persons or more, or gatherings of any size cannot maintain a consistent 6-foot distance between persons, are prohibited. So what that means is you are allowed to gather in groups of larger than 25, but if you do so, you have to be able to maintain at least 6 feet distance between each individual person. And if not, that gathering is prohibited. Now, interestingly enough, I do think that this somewhat, it doesn't quite violate, but it gets close to violating the freedom of assembly. But I think that no court, based on A, the circumstances, and B, the fact that the assembly is capable of taking place, there are just some parameters surrounding the assembly. I think that you would be hard-pressed to argue that there is actually a constitutional violation here. And, from my personal perspective as a Federalist and a big 10th Amendment guy, I don't even think that that actually applies to the states. But nonetheless, it continues on. This order shall apply to all gatherings, events, or activities that bring 25 or more persons in a single room or a single space at a time. So this is not just a gathering inside. Presumably, you would still be in violation of this order if you gathered more than 25 people outside. Even if there wasn't like a tent over your head or anything, if you just gathered them in a field, then you would technically be in violation of this order. Now, I don't exactly understand, and this is going to be a common theme that you're going to see as we go through this list. I don't really understand how they would enforce this, and it is borderline a freedom issue because, of course, we have the right to assembly guaranteed to us by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So I don't know that police officers and ALEA and other law enforcement officials would even be able to enforce this in any meaningful way. But that's the order as it was given. Here's the next one. Quote, any restaurant, bar, brewery, or similar establishment shall not permit on-premise consumption of food or drink. Governor Ivey continues to encourage patrons to visit their local eateries for takeout or delivery, provided the social distancing protocols include maintaining a consistent 6-foot distance between persons are followed. Now, again, this is something else that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because are you really going to enforce upon people that they are not allowed to eat in a bar or a restaurant unless, well, actually, this one doesn't even have a stipulation. They're just saying you can't eat at all on premise. So if I walk into a restaurant and get takeout and I buy a 25-cent mint and pop that in my mouth on my way out, then technically I'm in violation of this. I mean, again, I don't see how they're going to enforce this. I think that most of these, and this is, again, something you'll see as a continuing theme, I think these are actually good ideas. I'm not against the ideas themselves. I mean, for Pete's sake, I haven't left the house in 4 days. Like, I'm taking this very seriously. I'm just saying from a legal perspective, I'm not sure that the governor can actually do this. Now, she does say that she wants people to continue to go out to their local spots, and I'm sure that the restaurant people really appreciate that, the ones that own local businesses around here. But at the same time, if you're going there to get takeout, you are going to have human contact, and you are going to have contact with food that was prepared by other people. Again, I'm sure that this is significantly safer than sitting down and eating in a restaurant. But I don't see how you can enforce this. Let's say that I'm somebody that I'm an emergency worker and I can't go home. I don't really have a place to sit and eat. Are you telling me that it's actually illegal for me to walk into an Arby's or a Burger King and order some lunch? Again, I don't think that these are bad suggestions, but I think making them absolute rules and trying to enforce them is just frankly unrealistic. This one may actually be the one where she overreaches the most. All beaches will be closed effectively today at 5 p.m. For clarification, the term beach means the sandy shoreline area abutting the Gulf of Mexico, whether privately or publicly owned, including beach access points. So the beach at Stillwaters is apparently good to go. Like there's a lake beach there. There are river beaches around here. There's a sandy shoreline, but it's not abutting the Gulf of Mexico. I guess it's specifically talking about the Gulf. But one thing that is really strange here is whether privately or publicly owned, including beach access points. So let's say that I actually do own a spot of coastline on the Alabama shores. Let's say I own some property there at Gulf Shores. You're telling me that I can't go on my own property? I mean, that would be like banishing you from your backyard. That doesn't make any sense. I don't even understand how law enforcement could enforce that. I mean, could they, if you just ordered people to stay in their house and not go into their backyard, could a police officer just show up in your backyard and shoo you back into your residence? I don't think so, and I really don't think that this is constitutional. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't disagree with the idea that we do not need people hanging out in large groups on beaches. This is really the wrong time for that. But if it is your own private property, I don't see how the governor even has the legal authority to do this, much less actually enforce it and come down on people for it. I don't think it's a good idea, but I still don't understand how she can actually restrict it with the force of law. And I think that what's actually going on here is that she is trying to use very strong language and make it sound like a full-on restriction, knowing that it doesn't have any teeth in it, but she's trying to scare people into thinking that. If she had said, we strongly suggest that, well, then I'd be all in favor of all of this. There's not a single word of this I would have disagreed with. But the idea that she can actually restrict some of these things, I question that legality, and I'm very skeptical of it. I mean, the gatherings thing, maybe, but the other things, I don't think there's a legal precedent for that at all. Here's another one. Preschools and child care centers. Oh, wait, before I move on, I did want to mention this about the beaches. It turns out that 2 mayors of Gulf Shores and Orange Beach had already closed all public beaches earlier today. Now, they were going to close them a little later, so what Governor Ivey did was effectively step up the timetable for that. They were going to close them, I think, tomorrow, and she closed them today. But I think that that's really the model to follow, and I think that they should be the ones that make that decision, because the mayor of those cities, of course, they don't want to be held responsible for more people in the state and in their own jurisdictions getting sick, so it makes sense that they actually have a motive to do the right thing and to close the beaches there, but I don't like the heavy-handedness of the governor's office basically overshadowing them and saying that they wanted to do this. Look, the mayors of those towns who had the authority to close those beaches already did so. There was really no reason for the governor to step in and say this, especially with the overreaching step of saying we're going to close all private property beaches. Well, I don't even see how that's possible. But anyway, again, it seems as though the governor is wanting to walk around carrying a really big stick and just scaring people with it, as opposed to actually just offering these things as suggestions. And I even understand to a degree her saying that about public beaches, even though I think that decision should remain with the local authorities. But the idea that she can close off your own private property, she can deny you access to your own land, that seems really odd to me. All right, the next one. Preschools and child care centers will be closed effective at the close of school or business today. This shall not apply to licensed child care centers that provide services exclusively to employees with state and local governments, first responders, including EMS and fire services, law enforcement, hospitals, nursing home/long-term care facilities, including assisted living and specialty care assisted living facilities, end of retinal disease treatment centers, and pharmacies and grocery stores. What child care service in this state has an actual log of that? Like, are there going to be police officers going around and checking daycares and saying, I'm sorry, unless 100% of the people whose children you're watching are state and local government or first responders or work in a hospital or work in a grocery store, we're going to have to shut you down. That's absurd. I don't even know of a daycare that would be able to look that up. And let's say that they were. Let's say that they actually do have a log of all those things. Do you really think that the daycare is going to say, well, of the 20 kids that we watch, 19 of them fit that qualification, but we do have one that is just, his dad's a contractor. And so because of that, I guess we have to shut down the whole daycare because it says only if you offer childcare services to these people exclusively. Now, don't get me wrong. If I had a kid, I'm definitely not sending that kid to daycare right now. Like, that's the last thing I want to do. I'm not saying, again, that these things are bad ideas, but the idea that the government should be coming in and restricting them is absurd. Now, if you fall into one of these categories, if you happen to be a nurse that has to work in a hospital and there's nowhere else to keep your kids other than the hospital where the sick people are, yeah, I kind of see the reason that you would want to send them to daycare. That makes perfect sense to me. But the idea that the government should be the one deciding that, and unless a daycare center is offering services only to people that fit that bill, and if they have even one child that doesn't fit that bill, that they're going to shut them down for the time being, that just is absurd to me. And then another one, effective immediately, all hospitals and nursing homes / long-term care facilities, including assisted living and specialty care assisted living facilities, shall prohibit visitation of all visitors and non-essential health care personnel except for certain compassionate care situations, such as maternity and end of life. Now, again, this is something that seems odd and weirdly out of place, because I don't know of a single place like this, a nursing home, hospice care, any of those things, that would not have already done this. I mean, especially in a place that has a high concentration of elderly people, where people are extremely vulnerable to this thing. I don't see how any responsible person doesn't already do this, and so there's no reason for the state government to get involved and make these rules when people are already doing this of their own accord. And I, again, don't understand how you would enforce that, because there is an exception for certain situations, such as, which would be not exclusively, maternity care and end of life. So if you've got somebody on their deathbed, or you have someone having a baby, that definitely qualifies, but they didn't say exclusively those situations, which would mean that there could be a number of specialty situations, which honestly, I'm glad they left it open there. But again, it seems like a regulation that is completely unenforceable by the law. And so really this entire document is, it seems as though just designed to scare people into doing this. Because I really don't see how any of them actually have any teeth in them. And then the final one, which is kind of weird and also ironic, since I just mentioned the law not having any teeth in it, all elective dental and medical procedures shall be delayed effective immediately. Again, don't think it's a bad idea, but I would kind of tend to think that hospitals and doctors are already doing this. But let's say that you are a dentist and you're having to take care of somebody that has something that is, pretty essential. I guess that the way that they would get around that is they would say that it is, if it's elective, then they probably don't have to worry about it. But I don't really understand exactly why the government has to get involved in this either. Again, I think that every single one of these is a good idea. I just don't understand the government coming down with a heavy hand and trying to impose its will upon other people. But another thing that Ivey did, which this is within the governor and the government's purview, and I do agree with this step, she has delayed the election. So I was talking about this, I think 2 or 3 days ago. If you remember, you were watching the show that we were talking about this. I totally agree with this. I think that this was the right move by Governor Ivey, and I applaud her for doing so. You may remember that we were talking about Attorney General Steve Marshall actually was contacted by the Secretary of State, the guy in charge of the elections, John Merrill, who said, hey, is it possible for the governor to delay this thing? Because it's getting pretty close, and we're not real sure how this is going to turn out. Which, by the way, was smart on a number of levels, not only because we want people to stay away from each other and socially distance from one another, but who is the primary class of people you run into when you go to vote? Spoiler alert, it's old people. Not just the volunteers. It's uncommon for me to see anybody even close to my age when I go into my voting booth in Elmore County. I mean, I look around and there's people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. I don't see a lot of 30s and 20s. And I'm not saying I've never seen that, but it's rare. And so because of that, it definitely makes sense, especially considering there's a high concentration of the people in their 60s and 70s there, that when it comes to something like this, what they decide to do is just delay it until we have a better... Because here's the thing, that could really skew a turnout. Let's say, for example, and this isn't something that would really be affected all that much in the state of Alabama, but I'm just going to use it because it's the most vivid example that I can think of at the moment. Bernie Sanders has a very loyal base, primarily of younger people, people around the age of 30, some younger, some older, but around that 30 kind of being the medium age of his supporters. And Joe Biden, he has a very strong support in the older demographic. Well, let's say that one of these elections was taking place, and basically we did have an election earlier this week, and it didn't seem to really do anything to affect it. So, take this with a grain of salt. But it is at least theoretically possible that all the old people would stay away from the voting booths, and you would have a bunch of young people that don't care and are not nearly as worried about it that do go and vote. And then Bernie Sanders could win an election that normally Joe Biden would have if the circumstances had been different. So that's one way that it could skew an election, and it makes sense to me that Governor Ivey would delay it. She did delay it to July the 14th, which seems like a little far off, but I'm not going to complain too much because, I guess it being too far off and not having to reschedule makes a lot more sense than having it too close and then having to reschedule a second time. And it is, to some degree, fairer to the voters and fairer to the candidates to have a better idea of when this runoff election is going to be. It seems a bit late, especially when a lot of the projections are putting us at having, at the very least, a lull. At best, we don't have to deal with it again until fall. At least having a lull in this thing about May. I would have put it somewhere like May 15th. But she put it at July 14th, which seems a bit far. So now I want us to observe, is this going to help or hurt any one particular candidate? Well, there's a couple of factors that go into this. First of all, I think that typically the conventional political wisdom would tell us that the person that this is going to help the most is the person that has the most money. Typically, the reason that these runoffs can sometimes be a real drain on the candidate that has less money is because they already had to go through a very long process of campaigning, and their campaign ads or, their ad money or any other money that they might need is more or less shot by the time the election comes around. And so if it turns out they do have a runoff situation, then it's very difficult for them to be able to maintain the same pace and keep the campaign going. And so typically, the candidate that has the most money is favored by a runoff election. That's not always the case, but usually that's a pretty safe bet. Which in these particular elections would mean that Sessions has the edge over Tuberville. Probably not by much, because Tuberville does enjoy a pretty robust base of support with a lot of money. But at least to some degree, Sessions probably has at least a slight edge in that area if we're putting it off to July the 14th. Now, Jeff Coleman has way more money than Barrymore by leaps and bounds. And so because of that, I think that Barrymore is at a disadvantage having this runoff prolonged. But here's the thing. This is why it may actually not be such a bad idea for Barrymore. Barrymore's biggest problem is that his opponent, Jeff Coleman, has insanely high name recognition, which is basically everything in the state of Alabama. It's very rare that a candidate with more name recognition loses to one that has low name recognition. Or, lower, relatively. It's almost impossible to win if nobody knows who you are. But with Barrymore, part of the reason he was fighting such an uphill battle is because Jeff Coleman just dumped tons of money into his advertising, and a lot of people recognized his name whether or not they knew anything about his policies. I'm not saying that everybody who voted for Jeff Coleman was ignorant of that. I'm just saying, as a general rule, that's kind of the thing that you understand, that because he spent so much on advertising and had higher name recognition, that is an advantage to him. But in this lead up to the election, you'll notice that Jeff Coleman, who in the earlier polls had a very commanding lead because of his name ID, started dropping. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would it drop? Two things. First of all, his opponent's name ID was increasing. And another thing, the scandal that went on with him basically screwing the military out of about $700,000 worth and having to settle in a lawsuit because he and his company were loading more weight onto the trucks than they were supposed to be. People finding out about that had an effect on the election, and people recognized his name still, but they were less favorable towards him and started looking for other candidates. So typically, being in a runoff does favor the candidate with more resources, and this may very well be the case with Jeff Coleman. We don't know. We'll find out on July 14th. However, because he is trending downward, and Barry Moore gets more time to get his name out there, and has more time to talk about himself and his policies, and there is also more time for the voter to research Jeff Coleman and find out about some of the things that are kind of shady in his past, this might be something that actually winds up helping Barry Moore, because Barry Moore had a very uphill battle to pull this thing off in a month. He just did. And I like Barry Moore, but, I even said this in my interview with him, being honest, chances of him getting elected were pretty bad, just because of the way that the numbers shook out and everything. But this does give him a fighting chance, and it will be interesting to see what kind of effect it has on this election. Overall, I do think that this is a good idea, and I applaud Governor Ivey for bringing it to fruition. So, one other thing that I wanted to talk about, and honestly, and I hate to say this, I know that most of the news today has been awful. I understand it's been a rough news day for the state of Alabama when it comes to coronavirus. It just has. However, there is some really good news that might positively affect us, and it comes in the form of this new study done on the coronavirus, on COVID-19, the Wuhan Flu, whatever you want to call it, but done by AccuWeather, which is a meteorology service. You can actually get it on the app. Actually, AccuWeather is the weather service that I use on my own phone. But anyway, they did some research, they didn't do some research. They were reporting on some research that was done by a team of scientists, and the headline is that new study says that, quote, high temperature and high relative humidity significantly reduce the spread of COVID-19. So this is really good news for us. Let's go ahead and dive into this article. A team of researchers unveiled the results of a new study last week that looked at how temperature and humidity may affect the transmission of COVID-19, the illness caused by the new coronavirus. According to the researchers' findings, quote, high temperature and high relative humidity significantly reduce the transmission of COVID-19. An increase of just 1 degree Celsius and 1% relative humidity increase substantially lowers the virus's transmission, according to the data analyzed by the researchers. The study is the latest in a limited but growing body of research, not surprising considering how new this thing is, not all of which has been peer-reviewed, that examines the effect of weather and on the spread of SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the COVID-19 illness. Now, just so you're aware of this, the whole they've not been peer-reviewed thing, that's because this thing is relatively new. Those kinds of things, those kinds of reviews and critiques take time, and so while this thing will probably start coming out quicker than most because of the urgency of it, we're going to have to rely on uncorroborated tests, at least for a while, until they've had time to look at these things and find the flaws in the research. Going a little bit further down, the research studied 100 different Chinese cities that each had more than 40 cases of COVID-19 from January 21st to January 23rd. According to AccuWeather, senior weather editor and meteorologist Jesse Farrell, the decision to study the transmission on those dates was critical because that time period was before China intervened on January the 24th to stop the spread of the virus. Analyzing that time frame allowed for researchers to observe the natural spread of the virus before public health measures, which have since helped reduce the spread and drastically in China when they were permitted. Now, to be fair, this is not a great control group. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors that can contribute to this other than just weather and the fact that China has not rushed in to try to cause people to do things that enforce them to do things that would stop this, because you also have to consider that it's very well possible that people in China were doing exactly the same thing that a lot of people in America are doing, which is getting ahead of this thing and already starting to take certain steps to be able to stop the spread of this virus. Self-quarantining, staying away from people, wearing masks, not shaking hands, washing their hands more often. I mean, there's a myriad of factors that could happen with this. But when you're talking about epidemic testing, this is honestly kind of par for the course. This is not a great control group, but it's probably the best you can do, because you can't just infect one human being and keep them all in a cage together like rats and determine how this is going to affect people in the real world. And there would also be ethical issues with doing that as well. So there's a myriad of reasons why this is not an exact science. But based on the data that we have, which is being provided by the Chinese government, so again, has to be taken with a grain of salt, but comparing it to other Chinese cities that also would have been at least subject to the same scrutiny. In other words, China could be lying about all their numbers, but it's unlikely they would have only lied about numbers here and not numbers there. So it's at least a decent way to look at this thing. But right now, it's really the best that we can do. We have to deal with the data that we've got. This is probably the best way to do this, and I am poking some holes in it just to point out that this is not ironclad. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a good survey, and it doesn't mean the data collected and it won't be something that is useful to us, because based on this, they did the absolute best that they can, and it sounds like a lot of the criticism of this thing is more nitpicking than it is something that would cast doubt on the entirety of the results of this research. A little bit further down in the article, the paper showed that direct impacts of air temperature and humidity levels could be seen plainly in the severity of outbreaks during the earlier stages of the virus spread. In the early dates of the outbreaks, countries with relatively low air temperatures and lower humidity, for example, Korea, Japan, and Iran, saw severe outbreaks than warmer and more humid countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand do, the researchers wrote. Quote, considering the natural log of the average number of cases per day, February 8th to February 29th, as a rough measure of the severity of the COVID-19 outbreaks, the researchers continued, we show that the severity is negatively related to the temperature and relative humidity using 14 countries with more than 20 new cases during this period. So essentially the negative relation, all that means is the temperature goes up, the number of new cases goes down. That's a layman's terms way of saying that. So essentially, what is very promising about this is this data somewhat confirms data that we already had. In other words, there are a lot of countries from nations that do have a climate somewhat similar to this. A lot of the countries around the equator, for example, that are more lush, have high degrees of humidity, and have high degrees of heat even during the winter. And they're not really getting severe cases of COVID-19, which means it's far more likely that the virus is a lot harder to spread in those environments, which is very good news for us, because that means that this is probably more of a seasonal flu than it is something that we're going to have to deal with year-round or find some kind of vaccine for. This is also fantastic news for two other reasons. First of all, that means that there's a really good chance that it's seasonal, and if it is seasonal, that means that obviously we don't have to worry about getting sick in certain months of the year, at least for most locations. And the second reason that that's really good news is if it is seasonal, this gives our economy and our healthcare system a reprieve. So people are going to basically just stop getting sick if this thing is very hard to transfer in places with a high temperature and a high humidity rating. And then what happens as a result of that is a bunch of hospital beds open up, and we have time to prepare for wave 2, which could very well come this fall. We don't know that for a fact, but possibly that is the case, and it also gives our economy a chance to get back on its feet and be prepared for the second coming of this virus. So that's very, very good news for us. This isn't something, to give a good analogy, it means that we can land the plane and repair it before it takes off again. I mean, you never want to have to repair a plane while it's flying. Ideally, you would want it to be repaired while it's on the ground, and if you screw up, you know, nobody dies. You can take your time. You can be a little bit more careful. And so if that's the case, that means we get to land the plane, work on it a little while before we have to take off again. If this thing is not a seasonal flu and it just is constantly like this year-round, then we got to figure out a way to fix the plane while it's in flight without the thing crashing. And so you can see why it would be a lot easier if we get a reprieve from this, both from a healthcare and an economic standpoint. Now, a word of caution, the second year of the Spanish influenza was actually worse than the first year. So it is possible that even with a reprieve, even with this thing being a seasonal illness, that year 2 could still be significantly worse than the first. I hope that's not the case. I'm just saying, keep that in mind. And then a little bit further down in the same article, the sun angle changes significantly from the equinox to the solstice. AccuWeather meteorologist, astronomer, and astronomy blogger Dave Shamil explained. Quote, that means a significant amount of solar radiation or isolation will reach the ground. UV light has been proven to kill the coronavirus family like SARS and MERS, but there isn't research showing the same results for SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes it. So, again, this is an educated guess, and he's telling you in the article, hey, take this with a grain of salt, but the UV could also have a significant effect on it. In other words, the closer we approach the summer solstice, the more UV rays that we're getting directly, and that means that, you know, since the other viruses in this family are negatively affected by UV rays and are killed by it, then maybe the same thing happens here. Now, this wouldn't be great news for people, you know, south of the equator, because Australia's not going to be getting extra UV rays. But it does mean that this is even more likely to be a seasonal flu if that is the case. And then finally, this is the last quote we'll read from this article. Projected temperature increases over the next few months are expected to align favorably for U.S. residents if the findings published in this paper prove true. With much of the U.S. forecast to see higher than normal temperatures in April and May, according to AccuWeather meteorologist, there is a chance that the virus could eventually burn itself out, as Nicholas first suggested during a private press conference earlier this February. Quote, although it will also, of course, depend on other factors like each country's place on the curve of cases and the success of their response, Farrell said, adding to the outbreak, could also reemerge in the fall as past epidemics have. The good news would seem to be, at least the weather is not working against us for a few months, Farrell said. So here's really the thing I want to drive home. Because there seems to be good research in this paper that A, it may be a seasonal flu. In fact, it's very likely a seasonal flu. And B, if this thing is a seasonal flu, it may die out completely, or it may resurface this fall, but either way, we either get a reprieve or it's just gone and we never have to worry about it again. But here's the thing. Let's treat this thing as though it's not. Let's treat it as though this is not a seasonal flu. This is something that we have to deal with immediately and will have to deal with throughout the summer and make preparations for it. And let's also deal with this because the worst case scenario, if that happens, is that we're over-prepared. And the worst case scenario, if we don't do that, if we just assume that it's a seasonal flu and treat it that way, at least for now, before we know that for sure, is that we get caught with our pants down again and are poorly prepared for the second wave that could come sometime this summer. So, for the time being, until we have better and more reliable research, let's just assume that this thing is going to be an ever-present threat, even during the summer months. And the worst case scenario is we have a vaccine that we can't use in the fall. I mean, that's the worst thing that could happen to us. And just because we can't use it for this particular virus, if this virus just dies out because of UV rays or because of higher temperatures or whatever, even if that were to take place, then that means that what we are going to see is that we have a virus that is useless for a while but may come in handy later. In fact, one of the viruses that they're working with right now, I read a report about this the other day, they're actually working on an old malaria virus that they have seen has actually pretty good results with treating COVID-19. And so they're hoping that this old malaria vaccine might actually help them out in this fight. So maybe down the road, we look back and, oh yeah, you remember that COVID-19 vaccine that we made a long time ago? Yeah, that thing went away and we never had to worry about it again, but who knows? Maybe that helps us with this new disease. We'll call it Disease X that we're fighting with right now. And so there's a myriad of reasons why we should pursue this and get prepared and act as though this thing is going to be a constant threat for us in the future. Again, that doesn't mean panic, but it does mean take some precautions. And what's great about this is really good news for Alabama, because you think hot and humid. I mean, Alabama's got to be in your top list. It's, other than maybe the panhandle of Florida or the Amazon rainforest, there is no place that is more hot or humid than the state of Alabama. It is sweltering in here. And as somebody who loves cold weather, loves the winter, greatly prefers it to summer, I'm very much looking forward to summer if this means that we get rid of all of this mess. And I really hope that it does. But that being said, this is really good news for Alabama. It may mean that even if we are not in a great way, as I explained that we may very well be in a pretty bad way earlier in this report, that if this thing is seasonal and it is killed off by heat and humidity, well, I mean, that's great news for the state of Alabama. Also, maybe a good time to try to invoke a little global warming. If I think this is going to help us with the coronavirus, I may go outside and just burn gas in my Dodge Hemi. Well, I won't do that because it's way too expensive. But somebody needs to do that. Might be trying to warm this place up just a little bit to help us fight corona. But anyway, Alabama has been blessed with a lot of good relative news. This was a really bad news days for us, but hopefully better things are just around the corner, and that is certainly what I'm going to be praying for. And that last news report is really good news for the state of Alabama. Hopefully it comes to pass as well. Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be back with more on tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible printed on 100% organic biodegradable paper. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. And it says, Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Have you not read on your Bible apps that he who created him from the beginning made them male and female, and trans and pansexual and non-binary and Jupiter gender, or one of the 150 other options? And said, For this reason, a man/woman/other shall leave Z's father and mother, or father and father, or mother and mother, or two mothers, father, and their special friend Sequoia, and be joined to his wife, or wives, or husband, or life partners, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2 or 3 or 14, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. I mean, unless of course it's like super difficult, or there's money problems, or bedroom problems, or you meet somebody that you like better, or that initial spark goes away and you just fall out of love, or you're just unhappy for any reason, then divorce is totally understandable. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, Because Moses wasn't woke enough. He was some rich, spoiled prince who was probably white and a tool of the patriarchy. So why do you care what he thinks? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, it's totally cool with God as long as you're happy. That is all God wants, after all. The disciples said to him, That sounds super convenient. Thanks, Jesus. Wow. So inspirational. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back to the program. Thank you so much for being with us here on this Thursday evening. So, there's a lot of debate going on right now on the national stage as to how to react to coronavirus, and I can't dive into every single detail of it, and frankly, you probably wouldn't want that because I'd be here for 2 or 3 hours, which nobody's going to watch that much of Caleb, and I'm okay with that. I made my peace with that a long time ago. That's okay. But here are some of the specifics, and then I'm going to get into some of the principles underlying them. First of all, one, I'm going to spend very little time on because we did a Daily Dose of Stupid just a couple of days ago on this. If you are interested in it, go back to $1,000 for Every American. I think that's the name of it. It's in my Daily Dose of Stupid playlist on YouTube. Anyway, so that's one thing, just sending a whole bunch of checks to people. And this is a dumb idea for a myriad of reasons, and I explained it all in that video. But a couple things I wanted to point out here that I didn't really point out in that video. First of all, it seems odd to me that Nancy Pelosi is against this and Trump is in favor of it. Like, I find myself weirdly agreeing somehow with Nancy Pelosi. I'm sure that her motivation is way different than mine, because Nancy Pelosi has never cared about the Constitution, nor has she cared about the long march to socialism. In fact, she's been facilitating much of it. But the point is, she's still somehow against it, even though Trump has been for it and Steve Mnuchin has also been for it. So I'm a little bit at a loss and confused as to how this happened. But nonetheless, these are the way that everything is stacking up. I will say this, though, on this one. The memes have been phenomenal. Like, I can't tell you the number of memes that I've seen. And what's hilarious is both sides are using them against each other and not recognizing their own lack of consistency in it. Because if you are watching the memes, there's a whole bunch of people saying, oh, well, if Trump's sending out $1,000 checks to everybody, then all the people that said not my president, they don't get any checks. And then on the other side, you've got people on the left saying, oh, all those people that are Trump supporters, they better not be cashing in those $1,000 checks because that would be socialism. Which technically it's closer to communism, because communism is the redistribution of wealth, whereas socialism is more seizing the means of production. So they're technically both a redistribution of wealth, but socialism is more the government taking over industry and then redistributing it from the different companies, whereas communism is just trying to flatten the wealth curve and make everybody exactly the same on that. So technically this is closer to communism than it is socialism, but you know, those are minor details. And frankly, the difference between socialism and communism is so minute that it probably doesn't even bear repeating at this point. But nonetheless, the funny thing about these memes is that both are true. It absolutely makes no sense for anyone that claims any kind of conservatism or federalism or free market to be a free market person or a small government person. It makes no sense for them to advocate for any reason just blanketly sending a whole bunch of checks to people. Like, that is the furthest thing from free market, laissez-faire economics or conservatism. Even in an emergency situation like this, there is no reason to just send money to people. And then on the other side, all the people that were absolutely furious with Trump and hate him and think that he can't do anything right, they have no business saying all of that stuff and then saying, well, I'm going to take the check. I still hate him. Well, was it a good idea? Well, I don't want to talk about that. Well, at a certain point, you have to either admit all the people that were on favor of the universal basic income, people that are supporters, for example, of AOC or Andrew Yang, both of which champion this policy. A lot of Bernie supporters do too, but Bernie Sanders is less vocal about it himself. Anyway, those people have no sense calling President Trump an awful president when he's embracing one of your core ideals. That does seem pretty dang inconsistent. But anyway, that's really where we are. Again, if you want my personal take on it, if you want to understand where I stand on it, go through my archives, look at the Daily Dose of Stupid playlist there on YouTube, and be sure to check it out. I'll try to link it to this video and put a link up there somewhere as well. I'll see if I can do that. I may experiment with that a little bit later today. The second one, it does make a lot more sense than the first, and it is actually included in a deal that President Trump signed into law. Wait, hold on. I think that one in particular is being batted around in the House right now. So there's been about 4 different proposals, and 2 of them actually got some traction, and I can't remember which one is in the Senate, which one's in the House, and which one went to the president's desk. So I'm kind of juggling a whole bunch of stories at once here, but one of the deals, I think actually both of the deals, included free testing for the virus. Now, to some degree, I'm kind of on board with this one. But on the other side, I actually do see the point of making people pay for the test. And before you throw stuff at your computer, hear me out on this. One of the big issues that we've had, specifically here in the state of Alabama, where a testing facility actually crashed because of the massive lines and overcrowding of the testing facility, is because anybody can come and get tested at any time. And I'm not saying you should make the testing for the disease outrageous. Like, I actually heard that the test, when it initially came out, was roughly $500 to $1,000 in U.S. money. Well, if that's the case, I do think, and this is something that is a big step for a libertarian-minded person like myself, I think it makes sense for the government to step in and subsidize it. Because there is a vested interest to the taxpayer and to the country as a whole in knowing who has this thing and who doesn't, and having them know it so they can know to avoid people. In South Korea, who has tested a large portion of its population, this is something that really helped them. They had a whole bunch of other draconian things that the Constitution would never allow to fly in the United States, like actually keeping a GPS tracker on people and keeping them from going in areas where there were uncontaminated people. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's not a good approach. But them testing a whole bunch of people and knowing who had it and who didn't did really help them in their response and keep them from getting sick. And their economy, unlike a lot of the economies of, say, Italy and China, have not shut down completely. And so I do see a vested interest in the government providing this at a low cost. Because if you had to pay $5 or $10 to get tested, that would mean that a whole bunch of the people that are hypochondriacs and aren't symptomatic yet, but they just want to go in to test to see if they've got it, it would keep those people away. So again, I'm not saying that the government shouldn't step in here and that the federal government shouldn't provide a service here and pay for the vast majority of the bill. But I actually do think that having to throw $5 or $10 their way to get this test, I think that would add a little bit of accountability, and you wouldn't have people going in and getting tested multiple times that have no symptoms and clog up the system for people that actually do need the test. I think that that would make a significant difference. I understand the rationale. I'm just saying that I think that this would actually yield better results. Feel free to fire off about how I'm an evil, heartless person that hates people and wants them to die in the comment section. I know that it's coming. I'm just saying I think this actually would be better for the people, not only that have it, but the people who don't. I think that this would actually help us get over the virus faster if we had a small charge for it. But nonetheless, I know that I'm going to be called evil and heartless for this. Paid sick leave is another one that was included. Now, this seems really unfair to me, and I kind of go back to the thing that I was talking about earlier with some of Alabama's policies. It seems very unfair to me to force an employer to have to pay a person to not work. I get that you want people not to lose their job. I understand that people need to be paid so they can continue to live their life and to hunker down and do what they're supposed to do and socially distance themselves. Those things cost money. I know, I'm in the middle of doing it right now, and I'm very lucky that I'm a salaried employee, at least at one of my jobs. And the other job, I am a paid-by-the-hour employee, but I also work from home, so I can continue to do my work and get paid by the hour for that as well. I realize I'm in a really good situation, and I'm very grateful for that. And I realize there are people that are not. I've been in those jobs before. I have had situations like this arise before where I was just sick and couldn't work. That's happened to me multiple times. And so I totally get that. But at the same time, forcing an employer to pay a person not to work can have some catastrophic effects, not only on the economy as a whole, but on the employees themselves. Because generally speaking, a good company is going to recognize that it needs its employees and it needs to keep them healthy, and if nothing else, offer them something to try to keep them going. And a good company that realizes this is going to probably pay them to stay at home anyway. Again, it's another thing like a lot of the things that Alabama was doing that I think are good suggestions, but not good to mandate. And another thing that you have to consider, there may be a company that really is a good company, that really loves its employees and cares about them and would even give them, partial pay or something to help keep them going, but can't afford to pay them the full amount when business is down. What happens in a situation like that where you're talking about a vulnerable business? Well, if that is the case and they're not making money but have to pay their employees anyway, that means that business has to close its doors, and then those people are now sick and unemployed. So again, I think that there are ramifications that people at the top making these decisions and mandating down to businesses that they must comply with this aren't thinking about every scenario. And that's the problem with central planning as a whole. It cannot possibly plan for every contingency. There may be really good, really compassionate business owners that are willing to do the best that they can and even be willing to pay most of an employee's paycheck, but can't afford to pay the whole thing because if they do, they go under. And if they go under because of this government mandate, then all their employees have no jobs and no way to support themselves now or in the future. And so it's another example of how something like this can do a lot more harm than good. And evil, greedy corporations, and I know that there are some out there, that would just not want to pay the employees and say, screw it, we'll hire somebody else later, those companies are going to be hurt economically because of that. That's something that would be unsustainable as a business practice, especially in a robust jobs market, which we currently have, or at least had before the coronavirus hit, and probably will have after it comes back if everything goes well. But ultimately, getting away from these specific scenarios, I want to get to the larger principles. A couple things that we need to cover here. First of all, one of my big problems with a lot of these emergency measures is that a lot of these emergencies nearly always continue forever. There's never a sunset clause woven into the legal fabric of these laws. There's never an explanation of when this emergency is officially over. They just kind of stay around. A good example is, a lot of people may not realize this, we are now, right now, as of this moment, continuing to send foreign aid to Greece and Turkey, and that policy was started by President Truman in 1947. So here we are, 70 years after that took place, and we are still continuing a policy that President Truman started, a spending measure that he did, which he said they needed to do because Greece and Turkey's economies were about to go bust, and it was an emergency. This was an emergency situation, and because of that, President Truman decided that they needed to act and spent this money, and we are continuing to send money to them, despite the fact that that emergency ended a really, really long time ago. But when it comes to these things, that's usually what happens. The emergency just keeps going and it never ends, and we continue to spend money on these things. That's one of the big problems that I have with this. Because if you're going to come up with a policy that works for this, that actually does help stimulate the economy, and something that is going to cause the government to actually undo, you have to do something that the government will undo itself. Even though I hate to talk about this just because I know that this is the natural way that government operates, one thing that they're going to undo naturally, for example, is a tax break, because the government's always going to be asking for more money. So if the policy that was put in place for this emergency, for example, were, we're just not going to collect any taxes for the next couple months. Well, I actually think that would be a wonderful idea. And it makes sense that they would not be taking money from the American people at a time where they need to stimulate the economy. And if they were to do that, then of course the government would pick it up at the nearest available convenient time. The second this emergency goes over, the second that we no longer have this economic emergency, the government would go right back to taxing us. And there actually have been quite a few policies that President Trump has proposed that do fit along with this. For example, suspending the payroll tax. I mean, that was a fantastic idea. But when it comes to this, you need to recognize that we need to put measures in place that the government will undo naturally themselves, not one that can continue in perpetuity, because the government will never stop itself from spending money if it doesn't feel that it has to or has an interest in doing so. It will just continue to let things keep rolling, especially, which makes no sense, because if you personally had an emergency, for example, I had one of the biggest emergencies you can have. I had cancer. And I had to spend a lot of money while I had cancer, more money than I had. Thankfully, people were very generous with their donations. But when that happened, once the cancer was gone, I stopped spending the money. Why? Because it made no sense to spend money on things like chemotherapy and a whole bunch of other expensive things like eating out all the time because I didn't have the energy to cook. I didn't have the need to do that stuff anymore because the emergency was over. Government doesn't operate like that. When their emergency is over, they continue to keep spending. And so you have to make it in the government's interest to undo the policies that they put in place during emergencies. And what I've never understood is, why is it when the government comes to an emergency, that emergency spending is never accompanied by emergency cuts? Rand Paul actually proposed an amendment today that I thought was fairly reasonable. He's saying, yeah, this is a real emergency, and we need to spend some money on it. Why don't we make cuts to other parts of the budget so that we can spend this money? He said, and he gave this very eloquent analogy. If you were a person that had an emergency in their personal life, like let's say one of your kids got sick, well, wouldn't you look at your budget and say, okay, what can we cut out? What do we need to stop spending money on so we can devote more money to this thing that really is urgent that we need to take care of? Well, that makes perfect sense. Why don't people do that more often? That's the point that Rand Paul was making. Why is it that government doesn't do that? People can do it. People do it all the time. Why is it that the government says, no, we're just going to take out more loans and spend more money? Why is that always the first thing they do? The first thing they should do is look at the budget and say, the turtle tunnels, we're going to have to get rid of those. And the study on why drunk people fall down more often than sober people, we're going to have to get rid of that one. And, lots of foreign aid and building gas stations in Afghanistan. Maybe we should stop doing those at the very least until this really important issue, this big emergency, stops. So that's all Rand Paul's amendment did, is it said for every new spending measure that they put in place, they have to cut somewhere else. That, again, is a policy that government would undo itself once the emergency was really over, instead of creating new spending that just never goes away. That's how we've gotten to be $22 trillion in debt. I mean, if you think about it like Star Trek, what do they do in Star Trek when they know that a big blast is coming that is going to destroy their spaceship? Well, Captain Kirk says, all right, divert all power to shields. Why? Because that's where it's really important to have right now. Now, once the fight's over, they don't divert all the power to the shields. Once the fight is over, they're using it to, amp up the AC or, zoom around the universe, whatever it is that they're doing. But in that split second where there's an emergency, they divert all power to the shields because that's what they need the most at that time. They take power from other places where it is not needed at the moment to put it into the shields, which they're going to need in the very near future for impact. And then once that emergency is over, they go back to using power wherever they feel that it's needed most. Government should be doing exactly the same thing, but it never does. It just starts borrowing money from other people or taking it from the taxpayer in order to fund spending measures that have long since lost their urgency and usefulness, and that was the point that Rand Paul was making. And another thing that is really disturbing about this is the vast majority of these emergency measures not only are super expensive and continue in perpetuity because people just jump on board with them because they're freaked out, they also tend to not work. And that's unfortunate, but that tends to be the way that it is in government, is that most of the things that they try don't work. Sometimes they do, most of the time they don't. A great example is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Did you know that those programs were billed as programs that were going to end at some point, including Social Security? Now, behind closed doors, FDR knew that Social Security was never going to end and even bragged about it. But when it was billed to the American people, programs like Social Security, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, and other New Deal programs that he came up with, those things were supposed to end at a certain point after the Depression was over. What they did was they wound up extending the Depression by 8 years, making it worse by increasing government spending and taxation. And a lot of the programs that they started under the New Deal is that they had things like farm subsidies, price controls that actually made prices go up and made it harder for people to do these things and ended in a lot of waste. And so all that did was make the situation that they were in worse. And typically, a lot of these decisions that are made in panic and made in fear and not thoroughly thought out before they are put into place, like the New Deal was back then, and like a lot of these programs probably will be now, are going to meet the same fate. That's the reason I'm so skeptical of this, and the reason, as a general rule, I don't like a lot of these programs, because they don't even seem that they'll work, despite the fact that they also are probably going to be spending a lot of money, that there will be no budget cuts to supplement that spending of money, and that they will continue on forever. Now you understand why I get so frustrated with this stuff. Look, a situation like this is one of the very few times that I think government actually does have a legitimate role to play. That I think the government actually could do some good that will really help people. But the way that they're handling it does the opposite of that. All it does is increase spending, hurt the markets, hurt the economy. And eventually, what you wind up with is a system that does what it seems to do best: spend more money and never quit. Let's go on to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Now, today's daily dose of stupid is one that is both infuriating and, weirdly enough, does make you contemplate things. I think that you're going to be infuriated first, but... Oh, sorry, I had a flash there for a second. But anyway, I think that you're going to be infuriated first, but maybe you'll get a little... we'll try to go over the philosophical side of this in just a second. So here's a clip from CBS News of a bunch of college kids that went to spring break in Miami talking about that they really don't care about the coronavirus, and if they get it, and it's no big deal. So here they are.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying. You know, we've been waiting for Miami spring break for a while. About 2 months we've had this trip planned. 2-3 months. So we're just out here having a good time. Whatever happens, happens.
Like, it's really messing up with my spring break. What is there to do here other than go to the bars or the beach, and they're closing all of it? It's really messing up. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion. I think it's doing way too much.
Doing us bad. We need a refund. This virus ain't that serious. It's serious. It's more serious things out there like hunger and poverty, and we need to address that.
Yeah, I mean, we planned this a long time ago, and it was kind of up in the air if we still go, but like we're here. I just turned 21 this year, so I'm here to party, so it's kind of disappointing, but we're just making the most of it. We met these other people in our little Airbnb spot, so we're just hanging out with them and trying to get drunk before everything closes.
I mean, it sucks, but we're gonna make the best of it. We're enjoying ourselves. It sucks, and I'm from New Orleans, so this really sucks. However, we're gonna enjoy ourselves. We having day parties all day. It's my birthday, St. Patrick's Day. Turn up.
We're just trying to roll with we're just living for the moment. We're just gonna do what happens when it happens. When stuff closes, we're gonna do it when it closes. But besides that, we're just trying to have the best trip we can.
So, this is the height of being a self-absorbed, selfish, words I can't even say on the radio and shouldn't ever say. I mean, the level of selfishness just jumps out of the screen at you. Bunch of drunk colleges, oh, well, you know, if we get corona, it's just whatever. I mean, yeah, people could die from it, but it's not our problem, you know, where it's not going to stop us from partying. Woo! Like, this is what these people are. Gen Zers, if you wonder why boomers don't take you seriously, that's why. That's why they don't take you seriously. Because there are people like that roaming around, and that's what they tend to see. Now, I know that all of you are not like that. In fact, I know some very responsible young men and women in that generation. My brother among them. He even stayed home last weekend because he was worried about the coronavirus. He's taking this really seriously. I know a lot of young men and women that I work with that are in that age group, that are college students, that don't act like that. But there was an awful lot of people there that did. And sadly, this is probably not an all too uncommon attitude. I know that it's certainly prevalent on the internet. I would say it's still a minority of the generation, but there is a significant enough number of it that unfortunately people get the wrong idea in their head that everybody is kind of like that, because ultimately we're supposed to look out for each other. Ultimately what we're supposed to do is have one another's back. And yeah, maybe it has a low fatality rate, not a non-existent fatality rate, but a low fatality rate amongst young people. But it has a much higher one with older people, and you're going to come in contact either with an older person or somebody that is going to come in contact with an older person, which is the reason that you should be self-conscious of that and take preventative measures and responsibilities. You don't take the attitude of, oh yeah, screw the old people, I'm going to get out here and party, I've had this trip planned for months, woo! Do you not hear yourself? Do you not think about how your actions and bad decisions harm other people? This is as irresponsible as a drunk driver. Now, I'm not saying that it's, an exact moral equivalency, because even I could make an argument of how it's not an exact moral equivalency, because you're taking an action that may be irresponsible versus one that absolutely is. But with this, I just do not understand the mentality of somebody that is so callous towards his fellow man that he doesn't care if he's doing something that may very well end up in a loss of life. Because the truth is, every single one of these young people have parents and grandparents. Grandparents and who are probably closer to the age where this thing could really hurt them. And I imagine if the tables were turned, I imagine that if they were faced with a similar situation, let's say the virus worked in reverse and it had a high fatality for younger people, but didn't really affect older people as much, I have a feeling that the vast, vast, overwhelming majority of their grandparents would do the opposite of what these idiots are doing. They would have taken precautions, maybe even not so much for themselves, but because they're worried about other people in society, some of whom they are family with and some of whom they may never meet in their lives and never come across again. Doesn't matter. That's the kind of person that a lot of the people in that generation are. And the fact that they don't see it that way and that they don't care who they hurt with this, that, just really gets under your skin. But ultimately, you do have to remember, because I don't want to paint all Gen Zers like this, that this is a really bad sample. Because you say, well, why didn't they have any videos of some of the more responsible people? Well, the responsible kids aren't down there. That's the thing. They specifically went to a place where you're only going to see the irresponsible kids. Because a responsible person wouldn't have gone there. I had a number of my students, unfortunately, that continued to go on spring break despite the fact all this was going on. And I told them that that was dumb, but a bunch of them went anyway. Look, I get that it's inconvenient. I get that it sucks. There were a lot of things that I had planned to do in the near future. I'm probably not going to get to go to a baseball game that I had planned 2 or 3 months ago with my friends because of this thing. But that's the way that it goes. Sometimes these things, even if the baseball game were still going, if this thing were happening at a point where this thing was still prevalent, I would have to opt out because I do care about other people and want to take measures that ensure their safety. I had a frat brother, speaking of college, I had a frat brother ask me a really, really insightful question, and this is the more philosophical side of it that I was talking about. And he asked, and this is a direct quote, how does the non-aggression principle apply to this situation? Well, this is a fantastic question, and for those of you that are unaware, the non-aggression principle is essentially a libertarian esque idea, something that is held by a lot of conservatives in this country, that essentially, as long as you are not doing something that is aggressively harming another person, then it should be legally permissible. And this is one that kind of gets into a gray area. In fact, there are disagreements amongst even libertarians and libertarian-leaning conservatives on this issue. There are essentially two schools of thought. The first school of thought is this. This is so incredibly reckless that it actually constitutes an act of aggression. So basically, it comes down to the legal standard of criminal negligence, that just like it would be criminally negligent for you to leave a whole bunch of water on a floor and not warn anybody when you know that there are going to be people coming in that could hurt themselves. Something to that extent. Or something that is like an example that I just gave, driving while drunk. Well, that's something that is very likely to end in a fatality or bodily harm to someone. And because it is a activity that is so reckless, we actually criminalize it even though you're not actually hurting anybody. There's such a high degree of risk that you could, that we criminalize that activity. So I think that this does come dangerously close to that. I really do. But that's the first school of thought, and they would say that it absolutely does, and thus something like this ought to be banned. And this would, basically the threshold of aggression has been met, and therefore this would exceed the aggression needed on the non-aggression principle. Now, the second school of thought, and this is the one that I actually belong to, again, before you start throwing things at your computer, this is a very unpopular show for me. I've said that like 3 or 4 times in this one episode. But before you start throwing things at your computer, this is my rationale. So the second school of thought is basically, because this is an act of God, in other words, the beer doesn't enter your body by happenstance. Now, the beer did enter their body by happenstance, but I'm talking as a general principle. The virus doesn't enter your body by choice. See, when you're drinking and driving, you're the one that decided to get drunk. And then you're the one that decided to get behind the wheel. Now, in this scenario, you're the one that decided to put yourself at risk of contracting the virus. That's different than actually knowingly consuming the virus and then specifically going around other people to infect them. Now, that would be an act of criminal negligence. There's no argument from me or any other libertarian on that. But a lot of libertarians would say that because you are only potentially engaging in behavior that could end in contracting the virus and hurting another person, and you are not knowingly spreading it, or knowingly doing something that you know for a fact is reckless, it's just potentially reckless, that there is a little bit of difference there. And because a virus, of course, is an act that is nobody's fault, and nobody creates those circumstances intentionally, then it's something that is a little bit different than actual criminal negligence. And because you don't know whether or not you are infecting people, the libertarian would say, let's err on the side of liberty. In other words, they're free to act recklessly as long as they are not knowingly doing something that could endanger somebody. And so because of that, we have to allow them the freedom to do so. However, they would also say that it is incumbent upon the responsible person to be aware of the fact that there are stupid, reckless people like these idiots in the video. And because of that, we should take extra precaution. It is incumbent upon the individual to take these extra precautions for themselves. But here's really where this boils down to. I think that liberty is frankly far too valuable to be sacrificed for the sake of security. But I can understand why people like this are scared of that principle. I mean, being as set in my ways and firm in my beliefs as I am, I look at that video and I have to ask myself some serious questions about that, because there are people that are that stupid and that reckless. And I think probably the best way to describe this and to describe that sort of tug on your beliefs was described by Benjamin Franklin in this quote that he made at the Constitutional Convention in 1778, where he said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." Now, essentially what Franklin is saying there, and is frankly very well illustrated by this news broadcast, this video that CBS News put together, is that when people are virtuous, there is no call for a shackle on the people and a lack of liberty to take place. There is no call for tyranny because there is no need perceived for it. But the less moral we become, the less virtuous we become, the less responsible we are ourselves, the more people are going to say, that idiot shouldn't be allowed to do that. And, I understand that mentality and am sympathetic to it. I think that it's wrong. But at the same time, I get why people get there, especially after seeing something like that, where someone is so callous and so uncaring towards his fellow man that he will put having a good time ahead of the safety of other people. And watching that, it really does make it hard to argue for the fact that liberty is more valuable, but ultimately, it was our founders that saw it fit to give us this liberty. And that's why it is so important for us to realize that with liberty comes responsibility. Because if we fail to be responsible people with our freedoms, the calls will come to have them taken away. And the reason that we have gotten where we are in this country now is because we have not been responsible with our freedom. We have not done the things that we were supposed to do with them, and because of that, the calls for freedom to be curtailed have slowly eroded because of that. Because when it comes to things like giant government programs, welfare, so on and so forth, there would have never been any call for those things if the individual members of society, the churches, and the citizens were doing what they were supposed to be doing all along. There would be no reason for them to. And so because of that, we have to recognize if we want the government to do less, if we want more freedom, then we have to be more responsible with our liberty than ever before. These kinds of people are the reason people are afraid of freedom. And frankly, based on that, I understand that fear. I still think liberty is more valuable than security, but I get where they're coming from. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's chaplain's report comes from the book of Joshua, and I know that a lot of you that have been following and watch my chaplain report every day, and God bless you for the ones that do that. Thank you so much for doing that and remaining loyal to the program. You know that I've been going through Joshua and thinking a lot about this, and in a lot of ways, I think that this does relate to what we're going, and I don't want to stretch it or to make analogies or parallels where none exist, but I wonder if it was providence that I'm going through the book of Joshua at a time where there is so much uncertainty in the world, and where I think that it is very prevalent and very obvious that we have failed to do what God asked us to do. So to understand the context of what is going on in this particular verse and what's happening here, is Joshua has already taken the entire promised land. He has already delved out the parcels of land to each individual tribe, including the 3 tribes that remained on the other side of Jordan. They've been brought over. They've been given the inheritance that they were promised, that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they have all inherited the land, and they still have problems. There's still people there that are giving them trouble. But ultimately, Israel has been established in the promised land, and Joshua has fulfilled his mission. And in these verses, this is where Joshua is giving his send-off and sort of his parting thoughts before he meets his ultimate demise, the same fate that every man has to meet one day in his mortal death. So Joshua kind of gives the children of Israel these little thought nuggets to chew on and to remind them of what they should do, because he knows he's not going to be around to give them this message and to lead them anymore the way that he has in the past. So let's look at Joshua 23, verses 14 through 16, which states, "Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. It shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods, and bow down to them, and the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which he has given to you. Now, I know that the subject matter of this is pretty dark. And it's dark because that's exactly how Joshua intended for his readers to hear it. Those that heard his words, he wanted this to be a warning and telling them, look, you guys have just taken this land. God promised it to you. It's your inheritance. Take joy in that. But remember that it comes with a price. That it isn't something that you just get because you happen to be the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There is a relationship that you're supposed to maintain with God that comes along with the promise of this land. Because you'll remember that back when they were on Sinai with Moses, they made a covenant. That if they wanted to be God's people, if they wanted his protection, if they wanted the land that he promised him, promised to Abraham's descendants, there was a condition that came with that. That they had to obey him, to not chase after other gods, and to obey the laws of Moses. And Joshua wisely points out that, okay guys, so far, God has a 100% accuracy rating. You've seen that he prophesied all these things would happen. Every single one came true. Not a single one went unfulfilled. Now keep that in mind when I tell you this prophecy that I'm about to belch out to you. I think he was kind of setting the table there and saying, look guys, you know God has a 100% accuracy rating. Well, this is also coming from God. And I want you to remember that as I'm saying it. Because God has always upheld his end of the covenant. And he has said before multiple times, and I'm rehashing it and saying it again, if you fail to keep up your end of the covenant, God is not going to keep his end of the bargain either. There was a condition that came with his blessing. And you notice the absolute certainty that Joshua speaks with. In verse 15, he says, it shall come about. In a little bit later in verse 15, he says, the Lord will. In verse 16, he starts out with saying, when you transgress the covenant. In verse 16 later, he says that God's anger will burn against you. And then finally in verse 16, he also says that when this happens, you will perish quickly. So in all of these verses, Joshua is saying it as an absolute. He is giving a warning. He's telling them that they do have a choice, and they do have a choice. But he's saying that all of these things are going to come without question. It's not if you fail to keep the covenant, God might decide to take the land from you, or God's anger might burn against you, or you might be thrown into exile. He's saying, no, this is going to happen. And the promises today are really no different. If we fail to be obedient to his will, if we fail to have a relationship with Christ, if we fail to do the things that Christ taught us to do, then our relationship is going to be exactly the same. We're going to be kicked out of the promised land. All of these things, just like the Old Testament, there was a condition that came with them. There is an expectation that God has for us to fulfill the promises that he has given to us. Now, here's my question, and I really don't have a good answer to this one. Because he was saying this with such absolute certainty, is Joshua prophesying? Or is he just stating the terms and conditions of what he already knows to be true? And perhaps even integrating a little bit of his own wisdom, because unfortunately, Joshua's seen this play out before. He's seen that these people are not great at staying faithful to God. So is he saying this because he knows it's going to happen because it's a revelation from God? Is he saying this because he knows in his heart and is certain and has seen this episode play out so many times before that he knows that these people are going to betray him just because of his own human wisdom and his experience? Or is it possible that he is just saying this as saying, look, these are the terms. If you do this, then God will do X. If you don't do this, God will do Y. And this happens to be the Y. I'm really not sure. I think that any of them could be understood that way, and any of them would adequately apply to the situation that Joshua finds himself in. But one last thing that I wanted to add to this. One thing that this really does is it proves something that a lot of skeptics of the Bible try to point out over and over again. They try to say that God is brutish and evil and tribalist, and the God of the Old Testament is a terrible, evil being and character because he only cares about the Israelites. He doesn't love anybody else. He only cares about Israel and their well-being, and he kicked everybody else off of their land, which they were living in rightfully at the time, because he wanted what was for the Israelites. That's basically the only thing he cared about. Yeah, that's not the indication that we're getting here. In fact, if you look earlier in the book of Joshua, for example, with Rahab the harlot, God spared her and her family because they decided to follow God as opposed to the pagan gods that they were accustomed to. What happened to literally everybody else in the city? They were killed because they were engaged in all kinds of evil paganistic practices, including and not limited to killing their own children as a sacrifice to their pagan gods, murdering children for these things. This was the kind of people that they were. And you'll notice in this covenant that is being made here and in this prophecy by Joshua, he's saying, and if you do that, you will suffer the same fate. See, for God, it was never about the tribe. He had a special relationship with Israel, sure. And that's something that Israel was definitely appreciative of at some times, and sometimes, unfortunately, they weren't. But ultimately, it wasn't about, well, these are my people and all the other people are not my people. No, those people were held to a moral standard too. Israel, when they lived up to God's standard, were blessed. When they didn't, they lost the land too. God did not play favorites with them. And when Israel chose to defy him, he punished them for it just like he punished the other nations. This was not something that God gave them a special pass on. And this is something that Jesus emphasized in his own ministry as well, saying that you think that you're going to escape God's wrath because you're children of Abraham? God can make children of Abraham out of these rocks. You think that makes you special? Really? And that's essentially exactly the same thing that Joshua is saying to the children of Israel now. He's saying, yes, God gave you this land because you were obedient to him. If you stop being obedient to him and you start engaging in the things that these heathens have done, then he's going to kick you out of the land just like he kicked them out. And everything that I've predicted before this has come true, you better believe that that's going to come true as well. And one last lesson that we should take away from this. This should be a sobering and even terrifying thought to any people like the United States of America that have been very blessed with God's protection and providence in the past. Yeah, we've had it really good for a really long time. And God has been very generous to us. You know what? It can end in a heartbeat. If God all of a sudden decides that we no longer deserve the blessings that we have been given, he can and will take them away. Just like he's done to every other nation in the history of mankind. I mean, we could go as far back as talking about the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or we could talk about recently. We could talk about world events that have happened in the recent time, and I get that you have to be careful about ascribing providence to anything. But there is no nation that God has blessed that he will not cease his blessing if they turn on him. And America is no different. I'm really glad that God has blessed us with a lot of good things. But we will suffer the same fate as Israel if we fail to follow him. If we continue to follow after false gods, we are going to face a punishment because of that. You see, God ultimately is not a tribalist God. He's not a racist God. He's a just God. And a just God will punish those that refuse to obey him. Luckily, as Christians, there is a way to escape that punishment by coming into a conformity with his Son, by forming a relationship with him, by being washed of our sins in the waters of baptism, and walking in newness of life. That's the plan. And if we continue to do that, then God will keep his promise to us as well. You see, we're in a very different situation than they were in Joshua, in the sense that we're not Hebrews living in that time and we have a covenant with Christ and all of those things. But in a certain sense, we're in the exact same situation, that we are expected to do that which God asks of us in order to receive his blessings. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalrata Church of Christ. Copyright